Caesar, 100 to 44 BC. 1. The Rake. Caius Julius Caesar traced his pedigree to Iulus Ascanius, son of Aeneas, son of Venus, daughter of Jupiter. He began and ended as a god. The Julian gens, though impoverished, was one of the oldest and noblest in Italy. A Caius Julius had been consul in 489, another in 482, a Vopiscus Julius in 473, a Sextus Julius in 157, another in 91. From his uncle-in-law Marius he derived, by a kind of avuncular heredity, an inclination toward radical politics. His mother, Aurelia, was a matron of dignity and wisdom, frugally managing her small home in the unfashionable Subura, a district of shops, taverns, and brothels. There Caesar was born 100 BC, allegedly by the operation that bears his name. It was already an ancient mode of birth, being mentioned in the laws ascribed to Numa. Caesar's cognomen was not derived from the operation, caesus ab utero matris. Long before him there had been Caesars among the Julii. Now was this Caesar, says Holland's Suetonius, wondrous docible and apt to learn. His tutor in Latin, Greek, and rhetoric was a Gaul. With him Caesar unconsciously began to prepare himself for his greatest conquest. The youth took readily to oratory and almost lost himself in juvenile authorship. He was saved by being made military aid to Marcus Thermus in Asia. Nicomedes, ruler of Bithynia, took such a fancy to him that Cicero and other gossips later taunted him with having lost his virginity to a king. Returning to Rome in 84, he married Cossutia to please his father. When, soon afterward, his father died, he divorced her and married Cornelia, daughter of that Cinna who had taken over the revolution from Marius. When Sulla came to power, he ordered Caesar to divorce Cornelia. When Caesar refused, Sulla confiscated his patrimony and Cornelia's dowry, and listed him for death. Caesar fled from Italy and joined the army in Cilicia. On Sulla's death he returned to Rome, 78, but finding his enemies in power, he left again for Asia. Pirates captured him on the way, took him to one of their Cilician lairs, and offered to free him for 20 talents, $72,000. He reproached them for underestimating his value and volunteered to give them 50. Having sent his servants to raise the money, he amused himself by writing poems and reading them to his captors. They did not like him. He called them dull barbarians and promised to hang them at the earliest opportunity. When the ransom came, he hurried to Miletus, engaged vessels and crews, chased and caught the pirates, recovered the ransom, and crucified them. But being a man of great clemency, he had their throats cut first. Then he went to Rhodes to study rhetoric and philosophy. Back again in Rome, he divided his energies between politics and love. He was handsome, though already worried about his thinning hair. When Cornelia died, 68, he married Pompeia, granddaughter of Sulla. As this was a purely political marriage, he did not scruple to carry on liaisons in the fashion of his time, but in such number and with such ambigendered diversity that Curio, father of his later general, called him omnium mulierum vir et omnium virorum mulier, the husband of every woman and the wife of every man. He would continue these habits in his campaigns, dallying with Cleopatra in Egypt, with Queen Eunoe in Numidia, and with so many ladies in Gaul that his soldiers in fond jest called him Moicus Calvus, the bald adulterer. In his triumph after conquering Gaul, they sang a couplet warning all husbands to keep their wives under lock and key as long as Caesar was in town. The aristocracy hated him doubly, for undermining their privileges and seducing their wives. Pompey divorced his wife for her intimacy with Caesar. Cato's passionate hostility was not all philosophical. His half-sister Servilia was the most devoted of Caesar's mistresses. When Cato, suspecting Caesar's complicity with Catiline, challenged him in the Senate to read aloud a note just brought to him, Caesar passed it to Cato without comment. It was a love letter from Servilia. Her passion for him continued throughout his life, and merciless gossip in her later years charged her with surrendering her daughter Tertia to Caesar's lust. During the Civil War, at a public auction, Caesar knocked down some confiscated estates of irreconcilable aristocrats to Servilia at a nominal price. When some expressed surprise at the low figure, Cicero remarked in a pithy pun that might have cost him his life, tertia deducta, which could either mean a third off or refer to the rumor that Servilia had brought her daughter to Caesar. Tertia became the wife of Caesar's prime assassin, Cassius, so the amours of men mingle with the commotions of states. Probably these diversified investments helped Caesar's rise as well as his fall. Every woman he won was an influential friend, usually in an enemy's camp, and most of them remained his devotees even when his passion had cooled to courtesy. Crassus, though his wife Tertulla was reported to be Caesar's mistress, lent him vast sums to finance his candidacies with bribes and games. At one time, Caesar owed him 800 talents, $2,880,000. Such loans were not acts of generosity or friendship. They were campaign contributions, to be repaid with political favors or military spoils. Crassus, like Atticus, needed protection and opportunities for his millions. Most Roman politicians of the time incurred similar debts. Mark Antony owed 40 million sesterces, Cicero 60 million, Milo 70 million, though these figures may be conservative slanders. We must think of Caesar as at first an unscrupulous politician and a reckless rake, slowly transformed by growth and responsibility into one of history's most profound and conscientious statesmen. We must not forget, as we rejoice at his faults, that he was a great man notwithstanding. We cannot equate ourselves with Caesar by proving that he seduced women, bribed ward leaders, and wrote books. 2. The Consul. Caesar began as the secret ally of Catiline, and ended as the remaker of Rome. Hardly a year after Sulla's death, he prosecuted Gnaeus Dolabella, a tool of the Sullan reaction. The jury voted against Caesar, but the people applauded his democratic offensive and his brilliant speech. He could not rival Cicero's verve and wit, passionate periods, and rhetorical flagellations. Indeed, Caesar, 100 to 44 BC. 1. The Rake. Caius Julius Caesar traced his pedigree to Iulus Ascanius, son of Aeneas, son of Venus, daughter of Jupiter. He began and ended as a god. The Julian gens, though impoverished, was one of the oldest and noblest in Italy. A Caius Julius had been consul in 489, another in 482, a Vopiscus Julius in 473, a Sextus Julius in 157, another in 91. From his uncle-in-law Marius he derived, by a kind of avuncular heredity, an inclination toward radical politics. His mother, Aurelia, was a matron of dignity and wisdom, frugally managing her small home in the unfashionable Subura, a district of shops, taverns, and brothels. There Caesar was born 100 BC, allegedly by the operation that bears his name. It was already an ancient mode of birth, being mentioned in the laws ascribed to Numa. Caesar's cognomen was not derived from the operation, caesus ab utero matris. Long before him there had been Caesars among the Julii. Now was this Caesar, says Holland's Suetonius, wondrous docible and apt to learn. His tutor in Latin, Greek, and rhetoric was a Gaul. With him Caesar unconsciously began to prepare himself for his greatest conquest. The youth took readily to oratory and almost lost himself in juvenile authorship. He was saved by being made military aid to Marcus Thermus in Asia. Nicomedes, ruler of Bithynia, took such a fancy to him that Cicero and other gossips later taunted him with having lost his virginity to a king. Returning to Rome in 84, he married Casutia to please his father. When, soon afterward, his father died, he divorced her and married Cornelia, daughter of that Cinna who had taken over the revolution from Marius. When Sulla came to power, he ordered Caesar to divorce Cornelia. When Caesar refused, Sulla confiscated his patrimony and Cornelia's dowry and listed him for death. Caesar fled from Italy and joined the army in Cilicia. On Sulla's death, he returned to Rome, 78, but finding his enemies in power, he left again for Asia. Pirates captured him on the way, took him to one of their Cilician lairs, and offered to free him for 20 talents, $72,000. He reproached them for underestimating his value and volunteered to give them 50. Having sent his servants to raise the money, he amused himself by writing poems and reading them to his captors. They did not like him. He called them dull barbarians and promised to hang them at the earliest opportunity. When the ransom came, he hurried to Miletus, engaged vessels and crews, chased and caught the pirates, recovered the ransom, and crucified them. But being a man of great clemency, he had their throats cut first. Then he went to Rhodes to study rhetoric and philosophy. Back again in Rome, he divided his energies between politics and love. He was handsome, though already worried about his thinning hair. When Cornelia died, 68, he married Pompeia, granddaughter of Sulla. As this was a purely political marriage, he did not scruple to carry on liaisons in the fashion of his time, but in such number and with such ambigendered diversity that Curio, father of his later general, called him omnium mulierum vir et omnium virorum mulier, the husband of every woman and the wife of every man. He would continue these habits in his campaigns, dallying with Cleopatra in Egypt, with Queen Eunoe in Numidia, and with so many ladies in Gaul that his soldiers in fond jest called him moicus cauvus, the bald adulterer. In his triumph after conquering Gaul, they sang a couplet warning all husbands to keep their wives under lock and key as long as Caesar was in town. The aristocracy hated him doubly, for undermining their privileges and seducing their wives. Pompey divorced his wife for her intimacy with Caesar. Cato's passionate hostility was not all philosophical. His half-sister Servilia was the most devoted of Caesar's mistresses. When Cato, suspecting Caesar's complicity with Catiline, challenged him in the Senate to read aloud a note just brought to him, Caesar passed it to Cato without comment. It was a love letter from Servilia. Her passion for him continued throughout his life, and merciless gossip in her later years charged her with surrendering her daughter Tertia to Caesar's lust. During the Civil War, at a public auction, Caesar knocked down some confiscated estates of irreconcilable aristocrats to Servilia at a nominal price. When some expressed surprise at the low figure, Cicero remarked in a pithy pun that might have cost him his life, tertia deducta, which could either mean a third off or refer to the rumor that Servilia had brought her daughter to Caesar. Tertia became the wife of Caesar's prime assassin, Cassius, so the amours of men mingle with the commotions of states. Probably these diversified investments helped Caesar's rise as well as his fall. Every woman he won was an influential friend, usually in an enemy's camp, and most of them remained his devotees even when his passion had cooled to courtesy. Crassus, though his wife Tertulla was reported to be Caesar's mistress, lent him vast sums to finance his candidacies with bribes and games. At one time, Caesar owed him 800 talents, $2,880,000. Such loans were not acts of generosity or friendship. They were campaign contributions, to be repaid with political favors or military spoils. Crassus, like Atticus, needed protection and opportunities for his millions. Most Roman politicians of the time incurred similar debts. Mark Antony owed 40 million sesterces, Cicero 60 million, Milo 70 million, though these figures may be conservative slanders. We must think of Caesar as at first an unscrupulous politician and a reckless rake, slowly transformed by growth and responsibility into one of history's most profound and conscientious statesmen. We must not forget, as we rejoice at his faults, that he was a great man notwithstanding. We cannot equate ourselves with Caesar by proving that he seduced women, bribed ward leaders, and wrote books. 2. The Consul. Caesar began as the secret ally of Catiline and ended as the remaker of Rome. Hardly a year after Sulla's death, he prosecuted Gnaeus Dolabella, a tool of the Sullan reaction. The jury voted against Caesar, but the people applauded his democratic offensive and his brilliant speech. He could not rival Cicero's verve and wit, passionate periods, and rhetorical flagellations. Indeed, Caesar disliked this Asiatic style, and disciplined himself to the masculine brevity and stern simplicity that were to distinguish his commentaries on the Gallic and Civil Wars. Nevertheless, he was soon ranked as second only to Cicero in eloquence. In 68 he was chosen quaestor and was assigned to serve in Spain. He led military expeditions against the native tribes, sacked towns, and collected enough plunder to pay off some of his debts. At the same time, he won the gratitude of Spanish cities by lowering the interest charges on the sums that had been lent them by the Roman bankers. Coming at Gades upon a statue of Alexander, he reproached himself for having accomplished so little at an age when the Macedonian had conquered half the Mediterranean world. He returned to Rome and plunged again into the race for office and power. In 65 he was elected aedile, or commissioner of public works. He spent his money, i.e. the money of Crassus, in adorning the forum with new buildings and colonnades, and courted the populace with unstinted games. Sulla had removed from the Capitol the trophies of Marius, banners, pictures, and spoils representing the features and victories of the old radical. Caesar had these restored, to the joy of Marius's veterans, and by that act alone he announced his rebel policy. The conservatives protested and marked him out as a man to be broken. In 64, as president of a commission appointed to try cases of murder, he summoned to his tribunal the surviving agents of Sulla's proscriptions and sentenced several of them to exile or death. In 63, he voted in the Senate against the execution of Catiline's accomplices and remarked casually in his speech that human personality does not outlive death. It was apparently the only part of his speech that offended no one. In that same year he was elected Pontifex Maximus, head of the Roman religion. In 62 he was chosen praetor and prosecuted a leading conservative for embezzling public funds. In 61 he was appointed pro-praetor for Spain, but his creditors prevented his departure. He admitted that he needed 25 million sesterces in order to have nothing. Crassus came to his rescue by underwriting all his obligations. Caesar proceeded to Spain, led militarily brilliant campaigns against tribes with a passion for independence, and came back to Rome with spoils enough to pay off his debts, and yet so enriched the treasury that the Senate voted him a triumph. Perhaps the optimates were subtle. They knew that Caesar wished to stand for the consulate, that the law forbade candidacy in absence, and that the triumphator was required by law to remain outside the city until the day of his triumph, which the Senate had set for after the election. But Caesar forewent his triumph, entered the city, and campaigned with irresistible energy and skill. His victory was obtained by his clever attachment of Pompey to the liberal cause. Pompey had just returned from the East after a succession of military and diplomatic achievements. By clearing the sea of pirates, he had restored security to Mediterranean trade and prosperity to the cities it served. He had pleased the capitalists of Rome by conquering Bithynia, Pontus, and Syria. He had deposed and set up kings and had lent them money from his spoils at lush rates of interest. He had accepted a huge bribe from the king of Egypt to come and quell a revolt there, and then had refrained from carrying out the compact on the ground that it was illegal. He had pacified Palestine and made it a client state of Rome. He had founded 39 cities and had established law, order, and peace. All in all, he had behaved with judgment, statesmanship, and profit. Now he had brought back to Rome such wealth in taxes and tribute, goods captured and slaves ransomed or sold, that he was able to contribute 200 million sesterces to the treasury, add 350 million to its annual revenues, distribute 384 million among his soldiers, and yet keep enough for himself to rival Crassus as one of the 2 richest men in Rome. The Senate was more frightened than pleased at these accomplishments. It trembled when it heard that Pompey had landed at Brundisium, 62, with an army personally devoted to him and capable at his word of making him dictator. He magnanimously relieved its fears by disbanding his troops and entering Rome with no other retinue than his personal staff. His triumph lasted 2 days, but even that time proved insufficient for all the floats that pictured his victories and displayed his garnerings. The ungrateful Senate rejected his request that state lands be given his soldiers, refused to ratify his agreements with conquered kings, and restored those arrangements that Lucullus had made in the east and which Pompey had ignored. The effect of these actions was to break down Cicero's Concordia Ordinum, or alliance of the higher classes, and throw Pompey and the capitalists into a flirtation with the populares. Taking full advantage of the situation, Caesar formed with Pompey and Crassus the First Triumvirate, 60, by which each pledged himself to oppose legislation unsatisfactory to any one of them. Pompey agreed to support Caesar for the consulate, and Caesar promised, if elected, to carry through the measures in which Pompey had been rebuffed by the Senate. The campaign was bitter, and bribery flourished on both sides. When Cato, leader of the conservatives, heard that his party was buying votes, he unbent and approved the procedure as in a noble cause. The populares elected Caesar, the optimates Bibulus. Caesar had hardly entered upon his consulate, 59, when he proposed to the Senate the measures asked for by Pompey: a distribution of land to 20,000 of the poorer citizens, including Pompey's soldiers, the ratification of Pompey's arrangements in the East, and a 1/3 reduction of the sum which the publicans had pledged themselves to raise from the Asiatic provinces. As the Senate opposed each of these measures by every means, Caesar, like the Gracchi, offered them directly to the assembly. The conservatives induced Bibulus to use his veto power to forbid a vote, and had omens declared unfavorable. Caesar ignored the omens and persuaded the assembly to impeach Bibulus, and an enthusiastic popularis emptied a pot of ordure upon Bibulus's head. Caesar's bills were carried. As in the case of the Gracchi, they combined an agrarian policy with a financial program pleasing to the business class. Pompey was impressed by Caesar's performance of his pledges. He took Caesar's daughter Julia as his 4th wife, and the entente between plebs and bourgeoisie became a feast of love. The triumvirs promised the radical wing of their following that they would support Publius Clodius for the tribunate in the fall of 59. Meanwhile, they kept the voters in good humor with profuse amusements and games. In April, Caesar submitted his 2nd land bill, by which the areas owned by the state in Campania were to be distributed among poor citizens who had 3 children. The Senate was again ignored, the Assembly passed the bill, and after a century of effort the Graccan policy triumphed. Bibulus kept to his house and contented himself with periodical announcements that the omens were unpropitious to legislation. Caesar administered public affairs without consulting him, so that the town wits referred to the year as the consulate of Julius and Caesar. To bring the Senate under public scrutiny, he established the first newspaper by having clerks make a record of senatorial and other public proceedings and news, and post these acta diurna, or daily doings, on the walls of the forums. From these walls the reports were copied and sent by private messengers to all parts of the empire. Toward the end of this historic consulate, Caesar had himself appointed governor of Cisalpine and Narbonese Gaul for the ensuing 5 years. As no troops could lawfully be stationed in Italy, the command over the legions stationed in North Italy gave its possessor military power over the whole peninsula. To guarantee the maintenance of his legislation, Caesar secured the election of his friends Gabinius and Piso as consuls for 58, and married Piso's daughter Calpurnia. To ensure continued support from the plebs, he lent his decisive aid to the election of Clodius as tribune for 58. He did not let his plans be influenced by the fact that he had recently divorced his third wife, Pompeia, on suspicion of adultery with Clodius. 3. Morals and Politics. Publius Clodius Pulcher, the Handsome, was a scion of the Claudian gens, a young aristocrat whose courage knew no fear and his morals no restraint. Like Catiline and Caesar, he descended from his rank to lead the poor against the rich. To be eligible as a tribune of the people, he had himself adopted into a plebeian family. To redistribute the concentrated wealth of Rome and to destroy Cicero, who had abused his sister Clodia and stood for the sanctity of property, he served as a subaltern to Caesar until he could take power into his own hands. He admired Caesar's policies and loved Caesar's wife. To gain access to her, he disguised himself as a woman, entered the house of Caesar, then 62 high priest, took part in the ceremonies offered by women alone to the Bona Dea, was detected, accused, and publicly tried, 61, for having violated the mysteries of the good goddess. Caesar, called as a witness, said that he had no charge to make against Clodius. Why, then, asked the prosecutor, had he divorced Pompeia? Because, said Caesar, my wife must be above suspicion. It was a clever answer, which neither exonerated nor condemned a valuable political aid. Various witnesses, perhaps bribed, told the court that Clodius had had relations with Clodia and had seduced his sister Tertia after her marriage to Lucullus. Clodius protested that he had been away from Rome on the day of the alleged sacrilege. Cicero, however, testified that Clodius had on that day been with him in Rome. The populace thought the whole affair a senatorial plot to destroy a populares leader, and cried out for acquittal. Crassus, some say at Caesar's behest, bribed a number of judges for Clodius. The radicals for once had the more money, and Clodius was freed. Caesar took advantage of the situation to exchange an inconveniently conservative wife for the daughter of a senator allied to the popular cause. He had hardly retired from office when some conservatives proposed the complete annulment of his legislation. Cato did not conceal his opinion that these Julian laws should be wiped off the statute books. The Senate hesitated to fling so open a challenge to Caesar, armed with legions, and to Clodius wielding the tribunate. In 63, Cato had wooed the populace for the conservatives by renewing the state distribution of cheap corn. Now, 58, Clodius countered by making the dole completely free to all who came for it. He passed bills through the assembly forbidding the use of religious vetoes against legislative procedures and restoring the legality of the collegia, which the Senate had tried to disband. He reorganized these guilds into voting blocks and won such fealty from them that they provided him with an armed guard. Fearing that after his year as tribune had expired, Cato or Cicero might attempt to undo Caesar's work, Clodius persuaded the assembly to send Cato as commissioner to Cyprus, and to pass a decree banishing any man who had put Roman citizens to death without securing, as law required, the assembly's consent. Cicero saw that the measure was aimed at him and fled to Greece, where cities and dignitaries rivaled one another in offering him hospitality and honors. The assembly decreed that Cicero's property should be confiscated, and his house on the Palatine was razed to the ground. It was Cicero's good fortune that Clodius, overcome with success, now attacked both Pompey and Caesar, and planned to make himself sole leader of the plebs. Pompey retaliated by supporting the petition of Cicero's brother Quintus for the orator's recall. The Senate appealed to all Roman citizens in Italy to come to the capital and vote on the proposal. Clodius brought an armed gang into the field of Mars to supervise the balloting, and Pompey engaged a needy aristocrat, Annius Milo, to organize a rival band. Riot and bloodshed ensued, many men were killed, and Quintus barely escaped with his life. But his measure carried, and after months of exile Cicero returned in triumph to Italy. 57. Multitudes greeted him as he passed from Brundisium to Rome. There the welcoming crowd was so great that Cicero feigned fear that he would be accused of having contrived his banishment for the sake of this glorious restoration. Apparently he had pledged himself to Pompey and perhaps to Caesar as the price of his recall. Caesar lent him large sums to recoup his finances and refused to take interest. For several years now Cicero became the advocate of the triumvirs in the Senate. When a dearth of grain threatened Rome, 57, he secured for Pompey an extraordinary commission with full power for 6 years over all the food supply of Rome and over all ports and trade. Pompey again acquitted himself well, but the constitution of the Republic suffered another blow, and government by men continued to replace government by laws. In 56, Cicero persuaded the Senate to vote a substantial amount for the payment of Caesar's troops in Gaul. In 54, he unsuccessfully defended the extortionate provincial administration of Aulus Gabinius, a friend of the triumvirs. In 55, he canceled all the favor he had gained with Caesar by an abusive attack upon another provincial governor, Calpurnius Piso. He remembered too vividly that Piso had voted for his banishment. He forgot that Piso's daughter was Caesar's wife. Upon Cato's return, 57, from his brilliant reorganization of Cyprian affairs, the conservatives reformed their lines. Clodius, now the enemy of Pompey, accepted the invitation of the aristocracy to lend it the assistance of his popularity and his thugs. Literature took on an anti-Caesarian tint. The epigrams of Calvus and Catullus flew like poisoned darts into the camp of the triumvirs. As Caesar moved farther and farther into Gaul, and news came of the many dangers that he faced, hope sprung anew in noble breasts. After all, said Cicero, there are many ways in which a man may die. If we may believe Caesar, several conservatives opened negotiations with Ariovistus, the German leader, for the assassination of Caesar. Domitius, running for the consulate, announced that if elected he would at once move for Caesar's recall, which meant Caesar's indictment and trial. Veering with the wind, Cicero proposed that on May 25th, 56, the Senate should consider the abrogation of Caesar's land laws. 4. The conquest of Gaul. In the spring of 58, Caesar took up his duties as governor of Cisalpine and Narbonese Gaul, i.e., northern Italy and southern France. In 71, Ariovistus had led 15,000 Germans into Gaul at the request of one Gallic tribe seeking assistance against another. He had provided the desired aid and then had remained to establish his rule over all the tribes of northeastern Gaul. One of these, the Aedui, appealed to Rome for help against the Germans. 61. The Senate authorized the Roman governor of Narbonese Gaul to comply, but almost at the same time it listed Ariovistus among rulers friendly to Rome. Meanwhile, 120,000 Germans crossed the Rhine, settled in Flanders, and so strengthened Ariovistus that he treated the native population as subject peoples and dreamed of conquering all Gaul. At the same time, the Helvetii, centering about Geneva, began migrating westward, 368,000 strong, and Caesar was warned that they planned to cross his province of Narbonnese Gaul on their way to southwestern France. From the sources of the Rhine to the Atlantic Ocean, says Mommsen, the German tribes were in motion. The whole line of the Rhine was threatened by them. It was a movement like that when the Alemanni and the Franks threw themselves upon the falling empire of the Caesars, 500 years afterward. While Rome plotted against him, Caesar plotted to save Rome. At his own expense, and without the authority he should have sought from the Senate, he raised and equipped 4 extra legions besides the 4 already provided him. He sent a peremptory invitation to Ariovistus to come and discuss the situation. As he had expected, Ariovistus refused. Deputations came now to Caesar from many Gallic tribes asking for his protection. Caesar declared war against both Ariovistus and the Helvetii, marched northward, and met the Helvetian avalanche in a bloody battle at Bibracte, capital of the Aedui, near the modern Autun. Caesar's legions won, but by a narrow margin. In these matters we must for the most part follow his own account. The Helvetii offered to return to their Swiss homeland. Caesar agreed to give them safe passage, but on condition that their territory should accept the rule of Rome. All Gaul now sent him thanks for its deliverance, and begged his aid in expelling Ariovistus. He met the Germans near Ostheim, 10 miles west of the Rhine, 160 miles south of Cologne, and slew or captured, he tells us, nearly all of them, 58. Ariovistus escaped, but died soon afterward. Caesar took it for granted that his liberation of Gaul was also a conquest of it. He began at once to reorganize it under Roman authority, with the excuse that in no other way could it be protected against Germany. Some Gauls, unconvinced, rebelled and invoked the aid of the Belgi, a powerful tribe of Germans and Celts inhabiting North Gaul between the Seine and the Rhine. Caesar defeated their army on the banks of the Aisne. Then, with a celerity of movement that never allowed his foes to unite, he moved in succession against the Suessiones, Ambieni, Nervii, and Aduatuci, conquered them, despoiled them, and sold the captives to the slave merchants of Italy. Somewhat prematurely, he announced the conquest of Gaul. The Senate proclaimed it a Roman province, 56, and the common people of Rome, as imperialistic as any general, shouted the praises of their distant champion. Caesar recrossed the Alps into Cisalpine Gaul, busied himself with its internal administration, replenished his legions, and invited Pompey and Crassus to meet him at Lucca to plan a united defense against the conservative reaction. To forestall Domitius, they agreed that Pompey and Crassus should run against him for the consulate for 55 BC, that Pompey should be made governor of Spain, and Crassus of Syria for 5 years, 54 to 50, that Caesar should be continued for another 5 years, 53 to 49, as governor of Gaul, and that at the end of this term he should be allowed to seek a second consulate. He furnished his colleagues and friends from the booty of Gaul with funds to finance their campaigns. He sent great sums to Rome to provide work for the unemployed, commissions for his supporters, and prestige for himself, by an extensive program of public buildings, and he so oiled the palms of the senators who came to sample his loot that the movement to repeal his laws collapsed. Pompey and Crassus were elected consuls after the usual bribery, and Caesar returned to the task of persuading the Gauls that peace is sweeter than freedom. Trouble was brewing on the Rhine below Cologne. 2 German tribes had crossed into Belgic Gaul as far as Liège, and the nationalist party in Gaul was seeking their help against the Romans. Caesar met the invaders near Xanten, 55, drove them back to the Rhine, and slew such of them, women and children as well as men, as were not drowned in the river. His engineers then built in 10 days a bridge over the great stream, there 1,400 feet wide. Caesar's legions crossed and fought long enough on German soil to establish the Rhine as a secure frontier. After 2 weeks, he retraced his steps into Gaul. We do not know why he now invaded Britain. Possibly he was lured by rumors that gold or pearls abounded there, or he wished to capture the tin and iron deposits of Britain for Roman exportation, or he resented the aid that Britons had sent to the Gauls and thought that Roman power in Gaul must be made secure in every direction. He led a small force across the Channel at its narrowest point, defeated the unprepared Britons, took a few notes, and returned, 55. A year later he crossed again, overcame the British under Cassivellaunus, reached the Thames, exacted promise of tribute, and sailed back to Gaul. Perhaps he had heard that revolt was once more agitating the Gallic tribes. He suppressed the Eburones and marched again into Germany, 53. Returning, he left his main army in northern Gaul, while with his remaining troops he went to winter in North Italy, hoping to devote a few months to mending his fences in Rome. But early in 52 word came to him that Vercingetorix, the ablest of the Gallic chieftains, had united nearly all the tribes in a war for independence. Caesar's situation was precarious in the extreme. Most of his legions were in the north, and the country between them and himself was in rebel hands. He led a small detachment over the snow-covered Cevennes against Auvergne. When Vercingetorix brought up his forces to defend it, Caesar left Decimus Brutus in command, and, with a few horsemen, rode in disguise across all Gaul from south to north, rejoined his main army, and at once led them to the attack. He besieged, captured, and sacked Avaricum, Bourges, and Cenabum, Orléans, massacred their populations, and replenished his depleted supplies with their treasuries. He moved on to assail Gergovia. There, however, the Gauls resisted so resolutely that he was compelled to withdraw. The Aedui, whom he had rescued from the Germans and who heretofore had remained his allies, now deserted him, captured his base and stores at Soissons, and prepared to drive him back into Narbonnese Gaul. It was the lowest ebb of Caesar's fortunes, and for a time he considered himself lost. He staked everything upon a siege of Alesia, Alise-Saint-Reine, where Vercingetorix had gathered 30,000 troops. Caesar had hardly distributed a like number of soldiers around the city when word came that 250,000 Gauls were marching down upon him from the north. He ordered his men to raise 2 concentric walls of earth around the city, one before them, the other behind them. Against these walls and the desperate Romans, the armies of Vercingetorix and his allies threw themselves in repeated vain attacks. After a week, the army of relief broke up in disorder for lack of discipline and supplies, and melted into ineffectual bands at the very moment when the Romans had reached the end of their stores. Soon thereafter, the starving city sent Vercingetorix at his own suggestion as a prisoner to Caesar, and then surrendered to the Romans' mercy, 52. The town was spared, but all its soldiers were given to the legionaries as slaves. Vercingetorix was led in chains to Rome. There he later graced Caesar's triumph, and paid with his life for his devotion to liberty. The siege of Alesia decided the fate of Gaul and the character of French civilization. It added to the Roman Empire, a country twice the size of Italy, and opened the purses and markets of 5 million people to Roman trade. It saved Italy and the Mediterranean world for 4 centuries from barbarian invasion, and it lifted Caesar from the verge of ruin to a new height of reputation, wealth, and power. After another year of sporadic revolts, which the angry general put down with uncharacteristic severity, all Gaul accepted subjection to Rome. Once his victory was certain, Caesar became again the generous conqueror. He treated the tribes with such lenience that in all the ensuing civil war, when he and Rome would have been helpless to retaliate, they made no move to throw off the yoke. For 300 years Gaul remained a Roman province, prospered under the Roman peace, learned and transformed the Latin language, and became the channel through which the culture of classic antiquity passed into northern Europe. Doubtless neither Caesar nor his contemporaries foresaw the immense consequences of his bloody triumph. He thought he had saved Italy, won a province, and forged an army. He did not suspect that he was the creator of French civilization. Rome, which had known Caesar only as a spendthrift, rake, politician, and reformer, was amazed to find him also a tireless administrator and a resourceful general. At the same time, it discovered in him a major historian. In the midst of his campaigns, disturbed by the attacks upon him in Rome, he had recorded and defended his conquest of Gaul in commentaries, whose military conciseness and artful simplicity raised them, despite 1,000 milia passuum, from a partisan pamphlet to a high place in Latin literature. Even Cicero, shifting again, sang a paean in his praise, and anticipated the verdict of history. It is not the ramparts of the Alps, nor the foaming and flooding Rhine, but the arms and generalship of Caesar, which I account our true shield and barrier against the invasion of the Gauls and the barbarous tribes of Germany. It is to him we owe it that, should the mountains be leveled with the plain and the rivers be dried up, we should still hold our Italy fortified, not by nature's bulwarks, but by the exploits and victories of Caesar. To which should be added the tribute of a great German. That there is a bridge connecting the past glory of Hellas and Rome with the prouder fabric of modern history, that Western Europe is Romanic and Germanic Europe classic, all this is the work of Caesar, and while the creation of his great predecessor in the East has been almost wholly reduced to ruin by the tempests of the Middle Ages, the structure of Caesar has outlasted those thousands of years which have changed religions and states. 5. The degradation of democracy. During the second quinquennium of Caesar in Gaul, Roman politics had become an unparalleled chaos of corruption and violence. Pompey and Crassus, as consuls, pursued their policies by the bribery of votes, the intimidation of juries, and occasional murder. When their year of office ended, Crassus recruited and conscripted a large army and sailed for Syria. He crossed the Euphrates and met the Parthians at Carrhae. Their superior cavalry defeated him, and his son fell in the battle. Crassus was withdrawing his forces in good order when the Parthian general invited him to a conference. He went and was treacherously slain. His head was sent to play the part of Pentheus in a performance of Euripides's Bacchae at the Parthian court, and his leaderless army, long wearied of the campaign, disappeared in a disorderly rout. 53. Meanwhile, Pompey too had levied an army, presumably to complete the conquest of Spain. Had Caesar's plans matured, Pompey would have brought farther Spain and Crassus Armenia and Parthia within the orbit of Roman power at the same time that Caesar was extending the frontier to the Thames and the Rhine. Instead of leading his legions to Spain, Pompey kept them in Italy, except for one which he lent to Caesar in the crisis of the Gallic revolt. In 54, the strongest tie that held him to Caesar was cut by the death of his wife Julia in childbirth. Caesar offered him his grandniece Octavia, now Caesar's nearest female relative, and asked for the hand of Pompey's daughter, but Pompey refused both proposals. The debacle of Crassus and his army in the following year removed another balancing force, for a victorious Crassus would have opposed the dictatorship of either Caesar or Pompey. Henceforth, Pompey openly allied himself with the conservatives. His plan to secure supreme power through legal forms had now only one obstacle: the ambition and army of Caesar. Knowing that Caesar's command would expire in 49, Pompey secured decrees continuing his own command to the end of 46, and requiring all Italians capable of bearing arms to take an oath of military fealty to him personally. In this way, he trusted, time itself would make him master of Rome. While the potential dictators maneuvered for position, the capital filled with the odor of a dying democracy. Verdicts, offices, provinces, and client kings were sold to the highest bidders. In the year 53, the first voting division in the assembly was paid 10 million sesterces for its vote. When money failed, murder was available, or a man's past was raked over, and blackmail brought him to terms. Crime flourished in the city, brigandage in the country. No police force existed to control it. Rich men hired bands of gladiators to protect them or to support them in the comitia. The lowest elements in Italy were attracted to Rome by the smell of money or the gift of corn, and made the meetings of the assembly a desecration. Any man who would vote as paid was admitted to the rolls, whether citizen or not. Sometimes only a minority of those who cast ballots were entitled to vote. The privilege of addressing the assembly had on several occasions to be won by storming the rostrum and holding it by main force. Legislation came to be determined by the fluctuating superiority of rival gangs. Those who voted the wrong way were now and then beaten to within an inch of their lives, after which their houses were set afire. Following one such meeting, Cicero wrote, "The Tiber was full of the corpses of citizens, the public sewers were stuffed with them, and slaves had to mop up with sponges the blood that streamed from the forum." Clodius and Milo were Rome's most distinguished experts in this brand of parliament. They organized rival bands of ruffians for political purposes, and hardly a day passed without some test of their strength. One day Clodius assaulted Cicero in the street. Another day his warriors burned down Milo's house. At last Clodius himself was caught by Milo's gang and killed, 52. The proletariat, not privy to all his plots, honored Clodius as a martyr, gave him a mighty funeral, carried the body to the Senate House, and burned the building over him as his funeral pyre. Pompey brought in his soldiers and dispersed the mob. As reward, he asked from the Senate, and received, appointment as consul without colleague, a phrase that Cato recommended as more pleasant than dictator. Pompey then put through the assembly, cowed by his troops, several measures aimed at political corruption, and another repealing the right, which his Bill of 55 had granted to Caesar, to stand for the consulate while absent from Rome. He impartially supervised, with military force, the operation of the courts. Milo was tried for the murder of Clodius, was condemned, despite Cicero's defense, and fled to Marseilles. The speech, as it has come down to us, was much revised. It differed so much from the actual address, which had been confused by hostile disturbances, that when Milo read it he exclaimed, "O Cicero, if you had only spoken as you have written, I should not now be eating the very excellent fish of Marseilles." Cicero went off to govern Cilicia, 51, and acquitted himself there with a degree of competence and integrity which surprised and offended his friends. All the elements of wealth and order in the capital resigned themselves to the dictatorship of Pompey, while the poorer classes hopefully awaited the coming of Caesar. 6. Civil War. A century of revolution had broken down a selfish and narrow aristocracy, but had put no other government in its place. Unemployment, bribery, bread, and circuses had corrupted the assembly into an ill-informed and passion-ridden mob, obviously incapable of ruling itself, much less an empire. Democracy had fallen by Plato's formula. Liberty had become license, and chaos begged an end to liberty. Caesar agreed with Pompey that the Republic was dead. It was now, he said, a mere name without body or form. Dictatorship was unavoidable, but he had hoped to establish a leadership that would be progressive, that would not freeze the status quo, but would lessen the abuses, inequities, and destitution which had degraded democracy. He was now 54, and surely weakened by his long campaigns in Gaul. He did not relish a war against his fellow citizens and his former friends. But he saw the snares that had been prepared for him, and resented them as an ill reward for one who had saved Italy. His term as governor of Gaul would end on March 1st, 49. He could not run for the consulship until the fall of that year. In the interval, he would lose the immunity of an office-holder and could not enter Rome without subjecting himself to those proscriptions which were among the favorite weapons of party warfare in Rome. Already Marcus Marcellus had proposed to the Senate that Caesar should be deposed from his governorship before its expiration, which meant self-exile or trial. The tribunes of the plebs had saved him by their veto, but the Senate clearly favored the motion. Cato frankly expressed the hope that Caesar would be accused, tried, and banished from Italy. Caesar made every effort at conciliation. When, at Pompey's suggestion, the Senate asked both generals to release to it a legion for use against Parthia, Caesar at once complied, though his force was small, and when Pompey asked Caesar for the return of the legion sent him a year before, Caesar dispatched it to him without delay. His friends informed him, however, that instead of being sent to Parthia, these legions were being kept at Capua. Through his supporters in the Senate, Caesar requested a renewal of the Assembly's earlier decree, permitting him to stand for the consulship in absence. The Senate refused to submit the motion, and demanded that Caesar dismiss his troops. Caesar felt that his legions were his only protection. Perhaps he had nourished their personal loyalty with a view to just such a crisis as this. Nevertheless, he proposed to the Senate that both he and Pompey should lay down their commissions, an offer which seemed to the people of Rome so reasonable that they garlanded his messenger with flowers. The Senate favored the plan, 370 to 22, but Pompey balked at it. In the last days of the year 50, the Senate declared Caesar a public enemy unless he should abandon his command by July 1st. On the first day of 49, Curio read to the Senate a letter in which Caesar agreed to disband all but 2 of his 10 legions, if he might retain the governorship till 48. But he spoiled the offer by adding that he would look upon its rejection as a declaration of war. Cicero spoke for the proposal, and Pompey agreed to it, but the consul Lentulus intervened and drove Caesar's lieutenants, Curio and Antony, from the Senate house. After a long debate, the reluctant Senate, persuaded by Lentulus, Cato, and Marcellus, gave Pompey orders and powers to see that no harm should come to the state, the Roman phrase for dictatorship and martial law. Caesar hesitated more than was his wont. Legally, the Senate was right. He had no authority to name the conditions under which he would resign his command. He knew that civil war might bring Gaul to revolt and Italy to ruin, but to yield was to surrender the empire to incompetence and reaction. Amid his deliberations, he learned that one of his nearest friends and ablest lieutenants, Titus Labienus, had gone over to Pompey. He summoned the soldiers of his favorite 13th Legion and laid the situation before them. His first word won them. Commilitones, fellow soldiers. They who had seen him share their hardships and perils, who had had to complain that he risked himself too readily, recognized his right to use this word. He had always addressed them so, rather than with the curt milites of less gracious commanders. Most of his men came from Cisalpine Gaul, to which he had extended Roman citizenship. They knew that the Senate had refused to recognize this grant, and that one senator had flogged a Cisalpine Gaul just to show his contempt for Caesar's enfranchisement. It was illegal to flog a Roman citizen. They had learned to respect Caesar, even in their rough, mute way, to love him, during their many campaigns. He had been severe with cowardice and indiscipline, but he had been lenient with their human faults, had winked at their sexual escapades, had spared them unnecessary dangers, had saved them by skillful generalship, had doubled their pay, and had spread his spoils among them handsomely. He told them of his proposals to the Senate and how these had been received. He reminded them that an idle and corrupt aristocracy was unfit to give Rome order, justice, and prosperity. Would they follow him? Not one refused. When he told them that he had no money with which to pay them, they emptied their savings into his treasury. On January 10th, 49, he led one legion across the Rubicon, a small stream near Ariminum, that marked the southern boundary of Cisalpine Gaul. Lacta est alea, he is reported to have said, The die is cast. It seemed an act of folly, for the remaining 9 legions of his army were still distant in Gaul and could not reach him for weeks to come, while Pompey had 10 legions, or 60,000 troops, authority to levy as many more as he pleased, and funds to arm and feed them. Caesar's 12th legion joined him at Picenum, the 8th at Corfinium. He formed 3 legions more from prisoners, volunteers, and levies upon the population. He had little difficulty in getting recruits. Italy had not forgotten the Social War, 88, and saw in Caesar a champion of Italian rights. One by one, its cities opened their gates to him. Some turned out en masse to welcome him. The towns, wrote Cicero, salute him as a god. Corfinium resisted briefly, then surrendered. Caesar protected it from sack by his soldiers, freed all captured officers, and sent to Pompey's camp the money and baggage that Labienus had left behind. Though almost penniless, he refrained from confiscating those estates of his opponents that fell into his hands, a characteristically wise measure which won to neutrality most of the middle class. It would be his policy, he announced, to consider all neutrals his friends. At every new advance he tried again for reconciliation. He sent a message to Lentulus begging him to use his consular influence for peace. In a letter to Cicero, he offered to retire to private life and leave the field to Pompey, provided he should be allowed to live in security. Cicero labored to effect a compromise, but found his logic helpless before the rival dogmatisms of revolution. Though his forces still far outnumbered Caesar's, Pompey withdrew with them from the capital, and a disorderly stream of aristocrats followed him, leaving their wives and children to Caesar's mercy. Rejecting every overture of peace, Pompey declared that he would consider as an enemy any senator who did not abandon Rome and join his camp. The majority of the Senate remained in Rome, and vacillating Cicero, despising Pompey's vacillations, divided himself among his rural estates. Pompey marched to Brundisium and ferried his troops across the Adriatic. He knew that his undisciplined army needed further training before it could stand up to Caesar's legions. Meanwhile, he hoped, the Roman fleet under his control would starve Italy into destroying his rival. Caesar entered Rome, March 16th, unresisted and unarmed, having left his troops in nearby towns. He proclaimed a general amnesty and restored municipal administration and social order. The tribunes convoked the Senate. Caesar asked it to name him dictator, but it refused. He asked it to send envoys to Pompey to negotiate peace, but it refused. He sought funds from the national treasury. The tribune, Lucius Metellus, barred his way, but yielded when Caesar remarked that it was harder for him to utter threats than to execute them. Henceforth he made free use of the state's money, but with unscrupulous impartiality he deposited in the treasury the booty from his later campaigns. Then he returned to his soldiers and prepared to meet the 3 armies that the Pompeians were organizing in Greece, Africa, and Spain. To secure the grain supply upon which Italy's life depended, he sent the impetuous Curio with 2 legions to take Sicily. Cato surrendered the island and withdrew to Africa. Curio pursued him with the recklessness of Regulus, gave battle prematurely, was defeated, and died in action, mourning not his own death but the injury he had done to Caesar. Meanwhile, Caesar had led an army to Spain, partly to ensure the renewal of its grain exports to Italy, partly to forestall a rear attack when he marched to meet Pompey. In Spain, as in Gaul, he made serious blunders in strategy. For a time, his outnumbered army faced starvation and defeat, but as usual, he redeemed himself by brilliant improvisation and personal bravery. By altering the course of a river, he turned blockade into counter-blockade. He waited patiently for the entrapped army to surrender, though his troops fretted for action. At last the Pompeians gave in, and all Spain came over to Caesar, August 49. Returning toward Italy by land, he found his way blocked at Marseilles by an army under Lucius Domitius, whom he had captured and released at Corfinium. Caesar took the town after a hard siege, reorganized the administration of Gaul, and by December was back in Rome. His political position had been strengthened by this campaign, which had reassured the worried bellies of the capital. The Senate now named him Dictator, but he surrendered that title after being elected one of the two consuls for 48. Finding Italy in a credit crisis due to the fact that the hoarding of currency had depressed prices, and debtors were refusing to pay in dear money what they had borrowed in cheap money, he decreed that debts might be paid in goods valued by state arbitrators at pre-war prices. This, he thought, was the most suitable way both of maintaining the honor of the debtors and of removing or diminishing the fear of that general repudiation of debts which is apt to follow war. It is a revelation of how slowly reform had moved in Rome that he was compelled again to forbid enslavement for debt. He permitted the interest already paid on debts to be deducted from the principal, and limited interest to 1% per month. These measures satisfied most creditors who had feared confiscation. Correspondingly, they disappointed the radicals, who had hoped that Caesar would continue Catiline by abolishing all debts and redividing the land. He distributed corn to the needy, canceled all sentences of banishment except Milo's, and pardoned all returning aristocrats. No one thanked him for his moderation. The forgiven conservatives resumed their plotting against his life, and while he was facing Pompey in Thessaly, the radicals abandoned him for Caelius, who promised them a complete abolition of debts, the confiscation of large properties, and the reallotment of all land. Near the end of 49, Caesar joined the troops and fleet that his aides had collected at Brundisium. A winter crossing of the Adriatic by an army was in those days unheard of. The 12 vessels at his disposal could carry over only a third of his 60,000 men at one time, and Pompey's superior squadrons patrolled all islands and harbors along the opposite coast. Nevertheless, Caesar set sail and crossed to Epirus with 20,000 men. On their way back to Italy, his ships were wrecked. Wondering what delayed the remainder of his army, Caesar tried to recross in a small skiff. The sailors rowed out against the surf and were nearly drowned. Caesar, dauntless amid their terror, encouraged them with the possibly legendary exhortation, "Fear not, you carry Caesar and his fortune." But wind and wave tossed the boat back upon the shore, and Caesar had to abandon the attempt. Meanwhile, Pompey, with 40,000 men, seized Dyrrhachium and its rich stores. Then, with the indecision that marked his obese years, he failed to attack Caesar's depleted and starving force. During this delay, Mark Antony gathered another fleet and brought over the rest of Caesar's army. Ready now to join battle, but still loath to turn Roman against Roman, Caesar sent an envoy to Pompey proposing that both leaders should lay down their commands. Pompey gave no reply. Our only authority for this embassy is Caesar. Caesar attacked and was repulsed, but Pompey failed to follow his victory with pursuit. Against Pompey's advice, his officers put all captives to death, while Caesar spared his. A contrast that raised the morale of Caesar's troops and lowered that of Pompey's. Caesar's men begged him to punish them for the cowardice they had shown in this their first fight against Roman legions. When he refused, they besought him to lead them back to battle, but he thought it wiser to retreat into Thessaly and let them rest. Pompey now made the decision that cost him his life. Afranius advised him to return and recapture undefended Italy, but the majority of his counselors urged him to pursue and destroy Caesar. The aristocrats in Pompey's camp exaggerated the victory at Dyrrhachium and supposed that the great issue had there been decided. Cicero, who had finally joined them, was shocked to hear them dispute as to their respective shares in the coming restoration, and to see with what luxury they lived in the midst of war. Their meals served on silver plate, their tents comfortable with carpets, brilliant with hangings, garlanded with flowers. Excepting Pompey himself, Cicero wrote, the Pompeians carried on the war with such rapacity and breathed such principles of cruelty in their conversation that I could not contemplate even their success without horror. There was nothing good among them but their cause. A proscription was proposed, not only individually but collectively. Lentulus had promised himself Hortensius's house, Caesar's gardens, and Baiae. Pompey would have preferred a more Fabian strategy, but taunts of cowardice prevailed upon him, and he gave orders to march. At Pharsalus, August 9, 48, the decisive battle was fought to the bitter end. Pompey had 48,000 infantry, 7,000 horse. Caesar had 22,000 and 1,000. Some few of the noblest Romans, says Plutarch, standing as spectators outside the battle, could not but reflect to what a pass private ambition had brought the empire. The whole flower and strength of the same city, meeting here in collision with itself, offered plain proof how blind and mad a thing human nature is when passion is aroused. Near relatives, even brothers, fought in the opposed armies. Caesar bade his men spare all Romans who should surrender. As to the young aristocrat Marcus Brutus, he said, they were to capture him without injuring him, or if this proved impossible, they were to let him escape. The Pompeians were overwhelmed by superior leadership, training, and morale. 15,000 of them were killed or wounded, 20,000 surrendered, the remainder fled. Pompey tore the insignia of command from his clothing and took flight like the rest. Caesar tells us that he lost but 200 men, which casts doubt upon all his books. His army was amused to see the tents of the defeated so elegantly adorned and their tables laden with the feast that was to celebrate their victory. Caesar ate Pompey's supper in Pompey's tent. Pompey rode all night to Larissa, thence to the sea, and took ship to Alexandria. At Mytilene, where his wife joined him, the citizens wished him to stay. He refused courteously, and advised them to submit to the conqueror without fear, for, he said, Caesar was a man of great goodness and clemency. Brutus also escaped to Larissa, but there he dallied and wrote to Caesar. The victor expressed great joy on hearing that he was safe, readily forgave him, and at his request forgave Cassius. To the nations of the East, which, controlled by the upper classes, had supported Pompey, he was likewise lenient. He distributed Pompey's hordes of grain among the starving population of Greece, and to the Athenians, asking pardon, he replied with a smile of reproof, "How often will the glory of your ancestors save you from self-destruction?" Probably he had been warned that Pompey hoped to resume the contest with the army and resources of Egypt, and the forces that Cato, Labienus, and Metellus Scipio were organizing at Utica. But when Pompey reached Alexandria, Pothinus, eunuch vizier of young Ptolemy XII, ordered his servants to kill Pompey, presumably in expectation of reward from Caesar. The general was stabbed to death as he stepped upon the shore, while his wife looked on in helpless terror from the ship in which they had come. When Caesar arrived, Pothinus's men presented him with the severed head. Caesar turned away in horror and wept at this new proof that by diverse means men come to the same end. He established his quarters in the royal palace of the Ptolemies and set himself to regulate the affairs of the ancient kingdom. 7. Caesar and Cleopatra. Since the death of Ptolemy VI, 145, Egypt had rapidly decayed. Her kings were no longer able to maintain social order or national freedom. The Roman Senate increasingly dictated their policy and garrisoned Alexandria with Roman troops. By the will of Ptolemy XI, whom Pompey and Gabinius had established on the throne, the government had descended to his son Ptolemy XII and his daughter Cleopatra, who were to marry each other and reign together. Cleopatra was a Macedonian Greek by origin, and more probably blonde than brunette. She was not particularly beautiful, but the grace of her carriage, the vivacity of her body and her mind, the variety of her accomplishments, the suavity of her manners, the very melody of her voice, combined with her royal position to make her a heady wine even for a Roman general. She was acquainted with Greek history, literature, and philosophy. She spoke Greek, Egyptian, Syrian, and allegedly other languages well. She added the intellectual fascination of an Aspasia to the seductive abandon of a completely uninhibited woman. Tradition credits her with a treatise on cosmetics and another on the alluring subject of Egyptian measures, weights, and coins. She was an able ruler and administrator, effectively promoted Egyptian commerce and industry, and was a competent financier, even when making love. With these qualities went an oriental sensuality, an impetuous brutality that dealt out suffering and death, and a political ambition that dreamed of empire and honored no code but success. If she had not borne the intemperate blood of the later Ptolemies in her veins, she might have achieved her purpose of being the queen of a unified Mediterranean realm. She saw that Egypt could no longer be independent of Rome, and knew no reason why she should not dominate their union. Caesar was not pleased to learn that Pothinus had banished Cleopatra, and now ruled as regent for young Ptolemy. Secretly he sent for her, and secretly she came. To reach him she had herself concealed in some bedding which her attendant Apollodorus carried into Caesar's apartment. The amazed Roman, who never let his victories in the field outnumber his conquests in love, was captivated by her courage and wit. He reconciled her with Ptolemy, and re-established her with her brother on the throne of Egypt. Learning from his barber that Pothinus and the Egyptian general Achillas were plotting to kill him and slaughter the small force that he had brought with him, he delicately arranged the assassination of Pothinus. Achillas escaped to the Egyptian army and roused it to insurrection. Soon all Alexandria was alive with soldiers vowing death to Caesar. The Roman garrison, which had been stationed in the city by the Senate, was inspired by its officers to join in rising against this treasonable interloper, who presumed to settle the succession to the throne of the Ptolemies, and even to beget an heir for its future. In this emergency, Caesar acted with his customary resourcefulness. He turned the royal palace and the nearby theater into fortresses for himself and his men, and sent for reinforcements from Asia Minor, Syria, and Rhodes. When he saw that his defenseless fleet would soon fall into the hands of his enemies, he ordered it burned. In the fire, an uncertain portion of the Alexandrian library was consumed. By desperate sallies, he captured, lost, and recaptured the island of Pharos, as being essential to the entry of the relief he awaited. In one of these engagements, he swam for his life amid a storm of arrows, when the Egyptians drove him and 400 of his men off the connecting mole into the sea. Thinking the rebels victorious, Ptolemy XII left the royal palace, joined them, and disappeared from history. When reinforcements arrived, Caesar routed the Egyptians and the senatorial garrison in the Battle of the Nile. He rewarded Cleopatra for her fidelity to him in this crisis, by making her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, co-regent with her, which left her, in effect, the supreme ruler of Egypt. It is hard to understand why Caesar remained 9 months in Alexandria while hostile armies were being organized against him near Utica, and while Rome, stirred to radical revolt by Celius and Milo, longed for his fine administrative hand. Perhaps he felt that he deserved a little rest and play after 10 years of war. He often feasted with Cleopatra till daybreak, says Suetonius, and would have gone through Egypt with her in her royal barge almost to Ethiopia, had not his soldiers threatened mutiny. They had not all found queens. Perhaps he gallantly waited to share the pains of her confinement. A child was born to her in 47, and was named Caesarion. According to Mark Antony, Caesar acknowledged the boy as his son. It is not impossible that she whispered to him the pleasant thought of making himself king, marrying her, and uniting the Mediterranean world under one bed. This, however, is conjectural as well as scandalous. Nothing but circumstantial evidence supports it. Certainly Caesar flew to action when he learned that Pharnaces, son of Mithridates, had recaptured Pontus, Lesser Armenia, and Cappadocia, and was inviting the East to rise once more against divided Rome. His wisdom in pacifying Spain and Gaul before meeting Pompey was now apparent. Had the West revolted at one time with the East, the empire would probably have broken up, the barbarians would have moved southward, and Rome might never have known an Augustan age. Reforming his 3 legions, Caesar set out in June of 47, marched with characteristic speed along the coast of Egypt, through Syria and Asia Minor into Pontus, defeated Pharnaces at Zela, August 2nd, and sent to a friend at Rome the laconic report, Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. At Tarentum, September 26th, he was met by Cicero, who asked forgiveness for himself and other conservatives. Caesar consented amiably. He was shocked to find that during his 20 months' absence from Rome, the civil war had become a social revolution. That Cicero's son-in-law, Dolabella, had joined forces with Caelius and had proposed to the assembly a bill cancelling all debts. That Antony had let loose his soldiers upon Dolabella's armed proletaire, and 800 Romans had been killed in the Forum. Caelius, as praetor, had recalled Milo. Together they had organized an army in southern Italy and had invited the slaves to unite with them in a thoroughgoing revolution. They had met with small success, but their spirit was in the air. At Rome, the radicals were celebrating the memory of Catiline and again garlanding his tomb. Meanwhile, the Pompeian army in Africa had grown as large as the one that had been beaten at Pharsalus. Pompey's son, Sextus, had organized a new army in Spain, and the grain supply of Italy was once more hanging in the balance. Such was the situation in October 47, when Caesar reached Rome and Calpurnia, bringing with him Cleopatra, her boy husband-brother, and Caesarion. In the few months permitted him between campaigns, he set about restoring order. Having been reappointed dictator, he appeased the radicals for a moment by repealing the last of Sulla's laws and cancelling for a year all rents below 2,000 sesterces in Rome. At the same time, he tried to comfort the conservatives by making Marcus Brutus governor of Cisalpine Gaul, assuring Cicero and Atticus that he would abet no war against property, and ordering the re-erection of the statues of Sulla, which the proletaire had knocked down. When he turned his thoughts to the Pompeians, he was discouraged to hear that his most trusted legions were in revolt because of long overdue pay and were refusing to embark for Africa. As the treasury was nearly empty, he raised funds by confiscating and selling the property of rebel aristocrats. He had learned, he said, that soldiers depend upon money, money upon power, and power upon soldiers. He suddenly appeared among the rebellious legions, called them together, and quietly told them that they were released from service and might go to their homes. He added that he would make up all arrears to them when he had triumphed in Africa with other soldiers. At this expression, says Appian, shame seized upon them all that they were abandoning their commander in this moment when enemies surrounded him on every side. They cried out that they repented of their revolt and besought him to keep them in his service. He yielded with charming reluctance and sailed with them for Africa. At Thapsus, on April 6, 46, he met the combined forces of Metellus Scipio, Cato, Labienus, and Juba I, the Numidian king. Again he lost the first encounter. Again he reformed his lines, attacked, and won. His blood-crazed soldiers, blaming his clemency at Pharsalus for having to fight this second battle, slaughtered 10,000 of the 80,000 Pompeians, giving no quarter. They did not propose to meet these men again. Juba committed suicide, Scipio fled and died in an engagement at sea. Cato, with a small division, escaped to Utica. When the officers wished to defend the city against Caesar, Cato persuaded them that it was impossible. He provided funds for those who planned flight, but advised his son to submit to Caesar. He himself rejected both courses. He spent the evening in philosophical discussion. Then he retired to his room and read Plato's Phaedo. Suspecting that he would kill himself, his friends took his sword from his bedside. When they had relaxed their vigil, he compelled his servant to bring back the weapon. For a while he feigned sleep. Then suddenly he took the sword and plunged it into his abdomen. His friends rushed in. A physician put back the extruding intestines and sewed and bandaged the wound. As soon as they had left the room, Cato removed the bandage, tore open the wound, pulled out his entrails, and died. When Caesar came, he mourned that he had no chance to pardon Cato. He could only pardon the son. The Uticans gave the dead Stoic a magnificent funeral, as if knowing that they were burying a republic almost 5 centuries old. 8. The Statesman. After appointing Sallust governor of Numidia and reorganizing the provinces of Africa, Caesar, in the fall of 46, returned to Rome. The frightened Senate, recognizing the advent of monarchy, voted him the dictatorship for 10 years, and such a triumph as Rome had never seen before. He paid each of his soldiers 5,000 Attic drachmas, $3,000, much more than he had promised them. He feasted the citizens at 22,000 tables, and for their amusement provided a sham sea battle involving 10,000 men. Early in 45 he left for Spain, and at Munda defeated the last Pompeian army. When in October he reached Rome, he found all Italy in chaos. Oligarchic misrule and a century of revolution had disordered agriculture, industry, finance, and trade. The exhaustion of the provinces, the hoarding of capital, and the precariousness of investment had disturbed the flow of money. Thousands of estates had fallen into ruin. 100,000 men had been drawn from production into war. Peasants beyond number had been driven by the competition of foreign grain or latifundia slaves to join the proletariat in the towns and listen hungrily to promising demagogues. The surviving aristocracy, unmelted by Caesar's clemency, plotted against him in their clubs and palaces. He appealed to them in the Senate to recognize the necessity of dictatorship and to cooperate with him in a healing reconstruction. They scorned the advances of the usurper, denounced the presence of Cleopatra as his guest in Rome, and whispered that he was planning to make himself king and move the seat of the empire to Alexandria or Ilium. Caesar alone, therefore, though prematurely old at 55, set himself with Roman energy to remake the Roman state. He knew that his victories would be meaningless if he could not build something better than the wreckage that he had cleared away. When, in 44, his dictatorship for 10 years was extended for life, he did not much exaggerate the difference, though he could hardly foresee that in 5 months he would be dead. The Senate heaped adulation and titles upon him, perhaps to make him odious to a people that hated the very name of king. It let him wear the laurel wreath with which he hid his baldness, and carry even in peace the imperator's powers. Through these he controlled the treasury, and as Pontifex Maximus, the priesthoods. As consul he could propose and execute laws. As tribune, his person was inviolable. As censor he could make or unmake senators. The assemblies kept the right to vote on proposed measures, but Caesar's lieutenants, Dolabella and Antony, managed the assemblies, which in general favored his policies. Like other dictators, he sought to base his power upon popularity with the people. He subordinated the Senate almost to the role of an advisory council. He enlarged it from 600 to 900 members and permanently transformed it with 400 new appointees. Many of these were Roman businessmen. Many were leading citizens of Italian or provincial cities. Some had been centurions, soldiers, or sons of slaves. The patricians were alarmed to see the chieftains of conquered Gaul enter the Senate and join the rulers of the empire. Even the wags of the capital resented this and circulated a satiric couplet. Gallus Caesar in triumphum ducit, idem in curiam. Galli brachas depusuerunt, latum clavum sumserunt. Caesar leads Gaul in his triumph, then into the Senate. The Gauls have removed their breeches and put on the broad-rimmed toga of the senators. Perhaps Caesar purposely made the new Senate too cumbersome a body for effective deliberation or unified opposition. He chose a group of friends, Balbus, Oppius, Macius, and others, as an informal executive cabinet, and inaugurated the bureaucracy of the empire by delegating the clerical details of his government and the minutiae of administration to his household of freedmen and slaves. He allowed the assembly to elect half the city magistrates. He chose the rest by recommendations, which the assembly regularly approved. As tribune, he could veto the decisions of other tribunes or consuls. He increased the praetors to 16 and the quaestors to 40 to expedite municipal and judicial business. He kept a personal eye on every aspect of the city's affairs and tolerated no incompetence or waste. In the city charters that he granted, he placed severe injunctions and penalties against electoral corruption and official malfeasance. To end the domination of politics by organized vote-buying, and perhaps to secure his power against proletarian revolt, he abolished the collegia, except some of ancient origin and the essentially religious associations of the Jews. He restricted jury service to the two upper classes, and reserved for himself the right to try the most vital cases. Frequently he sat as judge, and none could deny the wisdom and impartiality of his decisions. He proposed to the jurists of his time an orderly codification of existing Roman law, but his early death frustrated the plan. Resuming the work of the Gracchi, he distributed lands to his veterans and the poor. This policy, continued by Augustus, for many years pacified the agrarian agitation. To forestall the rapid reconcentration of land ownership, he ruled that the new lands could not be sold within 20 years. And to check rural slavery, he passed a measure requiring that a third of the laborers on ranches should be freemen. Having turned many idle prolétaires into soldiers and then into peasant proprietors, he further diminished their ranks by sending 80,000 citizens as colonists to Carthage, Corinth, Seville, Arles, and other centers. To provide work for the remaining unemployed in Rome, he spent 160 million sesterces in a great building program. He had a new and more spacious meeting place for the assemblies set up in the field of Mars, and relieved the congestion of business in the Forum by adding, near it, a Forum Iulium. He embellished likewise many cities in Italy, Spain, Gaul, and Greece. Having so eased the pressure of poverty, he required a means test for eligibility to the state dole of grain. At once the number of applicants fell from 320,000 to 150,000. So far he had remained true to his role as a champion of the populares. But since the Roman Revolution was more agrarian than industrial, and was aimed chiefly at the landed slave-driving aristocracy than at the money-lenders, and only mildly at the business classes, Caesar continued the Gracchine policy of inviting businessmen to support the agrarian and fiscal revolution. Cicero sought to unite the middle classes with the aristocracy. Caesar sought to unite them with the plebs. Many of the great capitalists, from Crassus to Balbus, helped to finance him, as similar men helped the American and French revolutions. Nevertheless, Caesar ended one of the richest sources of financial profiteering, the collection of provincial taxes through corporations of publicans. He scaled down debts, enacted severe laws against excessive interest rates, and relieved extreme cases of insolvency by establishing the law of bankruptcy essentially as it stands today. He restored the stability of the currency by basing it upon gold and issuing a golden aureus, equivalent in purchasing power to the British pound sterling in the 19th century. The coins of his government were stamped with his own features and were designed with an artistry new to Rome. A novel order and competence entered the administration of the empire's finances, with the result that when Caesar died, the treasury contained 700 million sesterces, and his private treasury 100 million. As a scientific basis for taxation and administration, he had a census taken of Italy, and planned a like census of the empire. To replenish a citizenry decimated by war, he granted the Roman franchise widely. among others, to physicians and teachers in Rome. Long disturbed by the fall in the birth rate, he had in 59 given precedence in land allotments to fathers of 3 children. Now he promulgated rewards for large families and forbade childless women under 45 to ride in litters or wear jewelry, the weakest and most futile part of his varied legislation. Still an agnostic, though not quite free from superstitions, Caesar remained high priest of the state religion and provided it with the usual funds. He restored old temples and built new ones, honoring above all his alma mater Venus. But he allowed full liberty of conscience and worship, withdrew old prohibitions against the Isis cult, and protected the Jews in the exercise of their faith. Noting that the calendar of the priests had lost all concord with the seasons, he commissioned the Alexandrian Greek Sosigenes to devise, on Egyptian models, the Julian calendar. Henceforth the year was to consist of 365 days, with an added day in every 4th February. Cicero complained that Caesar, not content with ruling the earth, was now regulating the stars. But the Senate accepted the reform graciously and gave the dictator's family name, Julius, to the month Quintilis, which had been 5th when March opened the year. As impressive as these things done are the works begun or planned by Caesar, but postponed by his assassination. He laid the foundations of a great theater, and of a temple to Mars proportioned to that god's voracity. He appointed Varro to head an organization for the establishment of public libraries. He designed to free Rome from malaria by draining Lake Fucinus and the Pontine marshes, and reclaiming these acres for tillage. He proposed to raise dikes to control the Tiber's floods. By diverting the course of that stream, he hoped to improve the harbor at Ostia, periodically ruined by the river's silt. He instructed his engineers to prepare plans for building a road across central Italy and for cutting a canal at Corinth. The most resented of his undertakings was to make the freemen of Italy equal citizens with those of Rome, and the provinces ultimately equal with Italy. In 49 he had enfranchised Cisalpine Gaul. Now, 44, he drew up a municipal charter, apparently for all the cities of Italy, equalizing their rights with Rome's. Probably he was planning some representative government by which they would have had a democratic share in his constitutional monarchy. He took the appointment of provincial governors out of the hands of the corrupt Senate, and himself named to these posts men of proved ability, who remained at every moment subject to recall at his will. He reduced provincial taxes by 1/3 and entrusted their collection to special officials responsible to himself. He overrode ancient curses to restore Capua, Carthage, and Corinth, completing again the work of the Gracchi. To the colonists whom he sent to found or people a score of cities from Gibraltar to the Black Sea, he gave Roman or Latin rights, and evidently hoped to extend Roman citizenship to all free adult males in the empire. The Senate was then to represent not a class in Rome, but the mind and will of every province. This conception of government, and Caesar's reorganization of Rome and Italy, completed the miracle whereby the youthful spendthrift and roisterer had become one of the ablest, bravest, fairest, and most enlightened men in all the sorry annals of politics. Like Alexander, he did not know where to stop. Contemplating his reordered realm, he resented its exposure to attack at the Euphrates, the Danube, and the Rhine. He dreamed of a great expedition to capture Parthia and avenge his old pocketbook Crassus, of a march around the Black Sea and the pacification of Scythia, of the exploration of the Danube and the conquest of Germany. Then, having made the empire secure, he would return to Rome laden with honor and spoils, rich enough to end economic depression, powerful enough to ignore all opposition, free at last to name his successor, and to die with the Pax Romana as his supreme legacy to the world. 9. Brutus. When news of this plan trickled through Rome, the common people, who love glory, applauded. The business classes, smelling war orders and provincial loot, licked their chops. The aristocracy, foreseeing its extinction on Caesar's return, resolved to kill him before he could go. He had treated these blue bloods with such generosity as to stir Cicero's eloquence in his praise. He had forgiven all surrendering foes and had condemned to death only a few officers who, defeated and pardoned, had fought against him again. He had burned unread the correspondence he had found in the tents of Pompey and Scipio. He had sent the captured daughter and grandchildren of Pompey to Pompey's son Sextus, who was still in arms against him, and he had restored the statues of Pompey which his followers had thrown down. He had given provincial governorships to Brutus and Cassius, and high office to many others of their class. He bore silently 1,000 slanders, and instituted no proceedings against those whom he suspected of plotting against his life. To Cicero, who had trimmed his wind to every sail, S-A-L-E, he offered not only pardon but honor, and refused nothing that the orator asked for himself or his Pompeian friends. He even forgave, at Cicero's urging, the unrepentant Marcus Marcellus. In a pretty speech for Marcellus, 46, Cicero acclaimed Caesar's unbelievable liberality, and admitted that Pompey, victorious, would have been more vengeful. "I have heard with regret," he said, "your celebrated and highly philosophical remark, iam satis vixi. I have lived enough, whether for nature or for fame. Put aside, I beg you, that wisdom of the sage. Do not be wise at the cost of our peril. You are still far from the completion of your greatest labors. You have not yet laid their foundations." And he solemnly promised Caesar, in the name of all the Senate, that they would watch over his safety and oppose with their own bodies any attack upon him. Cicero now prospered so well that he planned to buy still another palace, no less than that of Sulla himself. He enjoyed the dinners to which he was invited by Antony, Balbus, and others of Caesar's aides. Never before had his letters been so gay. Caesar was not deceived. He wrote to Matius, "If anyone is gracious, it is Cicero, but I doubt not that he hates me bitterly." When reassured Pompeians resumed their opposition, this unctuous Talleyrand of the pen fell in with their hopes and wrote a eulogy of the younger Cato that should have put Caesar on his guard. Caesar contented himself with writing a reply, the anti-Cato, which did not show the dictator at his best. In this duel he had given Cicero